Chapter 21. From this moment Pencroff did not let a day pass without visiting what he called with perfect gravity, his corn-field. And alas, for any insects that ventured there, no mercy would be shown them. Near the end of the month of June, after the interminable rains, the weather became decidedly cold, and on the 29th, a Fahrenheit thermometer would certainly have stood at only 20 degrees above zero. The next day, the 30th of June, the day which corresponds to the 3 lst of December in the Northern Hemisphere, was a Friday. Neb said the year ended on an unlucky day, but Pencroff answered that consequently the new year began on a lucky one, which was more important. At all events, it began with a very cold snap. Ice accumulated at the mouth of the Mersey, and the whole surface of the lake was soon frozen over. Fresh firewood had continually to be procured. Pencroff had not waited for the river to freeze to convey enormous loads of wood to their destination. The current was a tireless motor, and conveyed the floating wood until the ice froze around it. To the fuel, which the forest so plentifully furnished, were added several cartloads of coal, which they found at the foot of the spurs of Mount Franklin. The powerful heat from the coal was thoroughly appreciated in a temperature which on the 4th of July fell to 8 degrees above zero. A second chimney had been set up in the dining room, where they all worked together. During this cold spell Cyrus Smith could not be thankful enough that he had conducted to Granite House a small stream of water from Lake Grant. Taken below the frozen surface, then conducted through the old weir, it arrived unfrozen at the interior reservoir, which had been dug at the angle of the storehouse, and which, when too full, emptied itself into the sea. About this time, the weather being very dry, the colonists, dressing as warmly as possible, determined to devote a day to the exploration of that part of the island situated to the southeast, between the Mersey and Claw Cape. It was a large swampy district and might offer good hunting, as aquatic birds must abound there. They would have 8 or 9 miles to go and as far to return, consequently the whole day must be given up. As it concerned the exploration of an unknown portion of the island, everyone had to take part. Therefore, on the 5th of July, at 6 o'clock in the morning, before the sun had fairly risen, the whole party, armed with spears, snares, bows and arrows, and furnished with enough provisions for the day, started from Granite House, preceded by Top, who gamboled before them. They took the shortest route, which was to cross the Mersey on the blocks of ice which then obstructed it. But, as the reporter very truly observed, this cannot supply the place of a real bridge, so the construction of a real bridge was set down as work for the future. This was the first time that the colonists had set foot on the right bank of the Mersey and had plunged into the forest of large and magnificent firs, then covered with snow. But they had not gone half a mile when the barking of Top frightened from a dense thicket where they had taken up their abode, a whole family of quadrupeds. "Why, they look like foxes," said Herbert, when he saw them scampering quickly away. And they were foxes, but foxes of enormous size. They made a sort of bark which seemed to astonish Top, for he stopped in his chase and gave these swift animals time to escape. The dog had a right to be surprised, for he knew nothing of natural history, but by this barking, the grayish-red color of their hair, and their black tails, which ended in a white tuft, these foxes had betrayed their origin. So Herbert gave them without hesitation their true name of culpeux. These culpeux are often met with in Chile, in the St. Malo group, and in all those parts of America lying between the 30th and 40th parallels. Herbert was very sorry that Top had not caught one of these carnivora. "Can we eat them?" asked Pencroff, who always considered the fauna of the island from that special point of view. "No," said Herbert, "but zoologists have not yet ascertained whether the pupil of the eye of this fox is diurnal or nocturnal, or whether the animal would come under the genus canine." Smith could not help smiling at this remark of the boy, which showed thoughtfulness beyond his years. As for the sailor, from the moment these foxes ceased to belong to the edible species, they ceased to interest him. Ever since the kitchen had been established at Granite House, he had been saying that precautions ought to be taken against these four-footed plunderers. A fact which no one denied. Having turned Jetsam Point, the party came upon a long reach washed by the sea. It was then 8 o'clock in the morning. The sky was very clear, as is usual in prolonged cold weather, but, warmed by their work, Smith and his companions did not suffer from the sharpness of the atmosphere. Besides, there was no wind, the absence of which always renders a low temperature more endurable. The sun, bright but cold, rose from the ocean, and his enormous disk was poised in the horizon. The sea was a calm, blue sheet of water, like a landlocked sea under a clear sky. Claw Cape, bent in the shape of an atagan, was clearly defined about 4 miles to the southeast. To the left, the border of the swamp was abruptly intercepted by a little point which shone brightly against the sun. Certainly in that part of Union Bay, which was not protected from the open sea, even by a sand bank, ships beaten by an east wind could not have found shelter. By the perfect calm of the sea, with no shoals to disturb its waters, by its uniform color, with no tinge of yellow, and, finally, by the entire absence of reefs, they knew that this side was steep, and that here the ocean was fathoms deep. Behind them, in the west, at a distance of about 4 miles, they saw the beginning of the forests of the far west. They could almost have believed themselves upon some desolate island in the Antarctic regions surrounded by ice. The party halted here for breakfast. A fire of brushwood and seaweed was lighted, and Neb prepared the meal of cold meat, to which he added some cups of Oswego tea. While eating they looked around them. This side of Lincoln Island was indeed barren, and presented a strong contrast to the western part. The reporter thought that if the castaways had been thrown upon this coast, they would have had a very melancholy impression of their future home. "I do not believe we could even have reached it," said the engineer, "for the sea is very deep here, and there is not even a rock which would have served as a refuge. Before Granite House there were shoals, at least, and a little island which multiplied our chances of safety. Here is only the bottomless sea." "It is curious enough," said Spilett, "that this island, relatively so small, presents so varied a soil. This diversity of appearance belongs, logically, only to continents of a considerable area. One would really think that the western side of Lincoln Island, so rich and fertile, was washed by the warm waters of the Gulf of Mexico, and that the northern and southern coasts extended into a sort of Arctic Sea." "You are right, my dear Spilett," replied the engineer, "I have observed the same thing. I have found this island curious both in its shape and in its character. It has all the peculiarities of a continent, and I would not be surprised if it had been a continent formerly." "What? A continent in the middle of the Pacific?" cried Pencroff. "Why not?" answered Smith. "Why should not Australia, New Ireland, all that the English geographers call Australasia, joined to the archipelagos of the Pacific Ocean, have formed in times past a sixth part of the world as important as Europe or Asia, Africa or the two Americas? My mind does not refuse to admit that all the islands rising from this vast ocean are the mountains of a continent now engulfed, but which formerly rose majestically from these waters." "Like Atlantis?" asked Herbert. "Yes, my boy, if that ever existed." "And Lincoln Island may have been a part of this continent?" asked Pencroff. "It is probable," replied Smith. "And that would explain the diversity of products upon the surface, and the number of animals which still live here," added Herbert. "Yes, my boy," answered the engineer, "and that gives me a new argument in support of my theory. It is certain after what we have seen that the animals in the island are numerous, and what is more curious, is that the species are extremely varied. There must be a reason for this, and mine is, that Lincoln Island was formerly a part of some vast continent, which has, little by little, sunk beneath the surface of the Pacific." "Then," said Pencroff, who did not seem entirely convinced, "what remains of this old continent may disappear in its turn and leave nothing between America and Asia." "Yes," said Smith, There will be new continents which millions upon millions of animalcule are building at this moment. And who are these masons? Inquired Pencroff. The coral insects, answered Smith. It is these who have built by their constant labor the island of Clermont-Tonnerre, the atolls and many other coral islands which abound in the Pacific. It takes 47 million of these insects to deposit one particle, and yet with the marine salt which they absorb, and the solid elements of the water which they assimilate, these animalcule produce limestone, and limestone forms those enormous submarine structures whose hardness and solidity is equal to that of granite. Formerly, during the first epochs of creation, nature employed heat to produce land by upheaval, but now she lets these microscopic insects replace this agent, whose dynamic power at the interior of this globe has evidently diminished. This fact is sufficiently proved by the great number of volcanoes actually extinct on the surface of the earth. I verily believe that century after century, and infusoria after infusoria will change the Pacific someday into a vast continent, which new generations will, in their turn, inhabit and civilize. It will take a long time, said Pencroff. Nature has time on her side, replied the engineer. But what is the good of new continents? Asked Herbert. It seems to me that the present extent of habitable countries is enough for mankind. Now nature does nothing in vain. Nothing in vain, indeed, replied the engineer, but let us see how we can explain the necessity of new continents in the future, and precisely in these tropical regions occupied by these coral islands. Here is an explanation, which seems to me at least plausible. We are listening, Mr. Smith, replied Herbert. This is my idea. Scientists generally admit that someday the globe must come to an end, or rather the animal and vegetable life will be no longer possible, on account of the intense cold which will prevail. What they cannot agree upon is the cause of this cold. Some think that it will be produced by the cooling of the sun in the course of millions of years, others by the gradual extinction of the internal fires of our own globe, which have a more decided influence than is generally supposed. I hold to this last hypothesis, based upon the fact that the moon is without doubt a refrigerated planet, which is no longer habitable, although the sun continues to pour upon its surface the same amount of heat. If then, the moon is refrigerated, it is because these internal fires, to which like all the stellar world it owes its origin, are entirely extinct. In short, whatever be the cause, our world will certainly someday cool, but this cooling will take place gradually. What will happen then? Why, the temperate zones, at a time more or less distant, will be no more habitable than are the polar regions now. Then human, as well as animal life, will be driven to latitudes more directly under the influence of the solar rays. An immense emigration will take place. Europe, Central Asia, and North America will little by little be abandoned, as well as Australasia and the lower parts of South America. Vegetation will follow the human emigration. The flora will move towards the equator at the same time with the fauna. The central parts of South America and Africa will become the inhabited continent. The Laplanders and the Samoyeds will find the climate of the Polar Sea on the banks of the Mediterranean. Who can tell but that at this epoch, the equatorial regions will not be too small to contain and nourish the population of the globe. Now, why should not a provident nature, in order from this time, to provide a refuge for this animal and vegetable immigration, lay the foundation, under the equator, of a new continent, and charge these infusoria with the building of it? I have often thought of this, my friends, and I seriously believe that, some day, the aspect of our globe will be completely transformed, that after the upheaval of new continents the seas will cover the old ones, and that in future ages some Columbus will discover in the islands of Chimborazo or the Himalaya, or Mount Blanc, all that remains of an America, an Asia, and a Europe. Then at last, these new continents, in their turn, will become uninhabitable. The heat will die out as does the heat from a body whose soul has departed, and life will disappear from the globe, if not forever, at least for a time. Perhaps then our sphere will rest from its changes, and will prepare in death to live again under nobler conditions. But all this, my friends, is with the Creator of all things. From the talking of the work of these infusoria I have been led into too deep a scrutiny of the secrets of the future. My dear Cyrus, said the reporter, these theories are to me prophecies. Some day they will be accomplished. It is a secret with the Almighty, replied Smith. All this is well and good, said Pencroff, who had listened with all his ears, but will you tell me, Mr. Smith, if Lincoln Island has been constructed by these infusoria? No, replied Smith, it is of purely volcanic origin. Then it will probably disappear some day. I hope sincerely we won't be here. No, be easy, Pencroff, we will get away. In the meantime, said Spilett, let us settle ourselves as if forever. It is never worth while to do anything by halves. This ended the conversation. Breakfast was over, the exploration continued, and the party soon arrived at the beginning of the swampy district. It was, indeed, a marsh which extended as far as the rounded side forming the southeastern termination of the island, and measuring 20 square miles. The soil was formed of a silicious clay mixed with decayed vegetation. It was covered by conferve, rushes, sedges, and here and there by beds of herbage, thick as a velvet carpet. In many places frozen pools glistened under the sun's rays. Neither rains, nor any river swollen by a sudden increase could have produced this water. One would naturally conclude that this swamp was fed by the infiltration of water through the soil. And this was the fact. It was even to be feared that the air here during hot weather was laden with that miasma which engenders the marsh fever. Above the aquatic herbs on the surface of the stagnant waters, a swarm of birds were flying. A hunter would not have lost a single shot. Wild ducks, teal, and snipe lived there in flocks, and it was easy to approach these fearless creatures. So thick were these birds that a charge of shot would certainly have brought down a dozen of them, but our friends had to content themselves with their bows and arrows. The slaughter was less, but the quiet arrow had the advantage of not frightening the birds, while the sound of firearms would have scattered them to every corner of the swamp. The hunters contented themselves this time with a dozen ducks, with white bodies, cinnamon-colored belts, green heads, wings black, white, and red, and feathered beaks. These Herbert recognized as the Tadorns. Top did his share well in the capture of these birds, whose name was given this swampy district. The colonists now had an abundant reserve of aquatic game. When the time should come, the only question would be how to make a proper use of them, and it was probable that several species of these birds would be, if not domesticated, at least acclimated, upon the borders of the lake, which would bring them nearer to the place of consumption. About 5 o'clock in the afternoon Smith and his companions turned their faces homewards. They crossed Tadorn's Fens, and recrossed the Mersey upon the ice, arriving at Granite House at 8 o'clock in the evening.